welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for April 2nd, 2013. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. I'm joined today with Jim Clausing and John Hogoboom, a couple of regulars on the program. I'm Brian Rexroad, and thanks for joining us. And we'll go ahead right over to John as a starter here. And John, it seems like there just is no shortage of ways to get remote access to computers against your will, and I guess you've found another one here for us, right?
Yeah, well, I didn't find it. However, some of the people at Webroot actually posted a blog about this, and there's kind of a trend going on that I wanted to talk about. So we've talked about a lot over the past couple of years about Black Hole Exploit Kit and these various toolkits. A lot of them are bundled toolkits that you can download and buy that have various exploit packs in them for various things like Java and Flash and whatnot. Usually they're designed so that they'll drop a particular kind of payload on there, either a Zeus game over type crimeware or Crydex or some other piece of malware. Mm-hmm. So what we've been seeing is they have the first story, which came out maybe a month or so ago, is about they're using, it's kind of a roll your own using the Java exploits that have been popularized over the past few months here and exploited a lot to drop a native Dark Comet remote administration toolkit onto the machine. Mm-hmm. There's a couple of interesting things about this, because this also isn't new, but they're kind of operating this one as a hosted service. So you can actually go to a website and say, I would like to host a rogue website there, and they'll clone the website for you. They also give you some toolkits to do that if you want to run it on your own web server. So I could say, well, maybe I want to pretend I'm, Acme Company or some fictional company or whatever. I can go download their entire website, make a copy of it, and it will put the malicious payload in the fake copy, and then you have to lure people to go there. And then once you do that, they'll get infected, and it'll drop this remote administration toolkit on there. They have that as a hosted service. It also, when it's hosted, they have it auto updates to create a FUD jar, which is a fully undetectable jar applet, so that it will maintain its ability to thwart or skirt around any antivirus that the people might have on their machines. So that's one thing that I wanted to mention that's been going on, leveraging Java as an exploit vector to get remote administration toolkits on there. And it's been done in a targeted way, by the way. So usually people doing this are cloning websites where they might be trying to, they know people might be going there, and they'll target victims. They'll clone a website for something that they know victims might be trafficking to, and they'll make a somewhat changed version of that domain name, register it, and have a rogue website that looks very close to the real one. The other trend that they put out an article yesterday about this is, so instead of using Java as an exploit vector to drop a native payload, they've actually made an entire Java-based remote administration toolkit in Java itself. So it's coded entirely in Java. It works in a drive-by mechanism as well. So if you just browse to a infected web page, if you're lured there, it will run the applet in your browser, which will provide whoever's waiting on the other end to have remote administration to your machine. So the interesting thing about this, it works on Linux, Mac, Windows, because it's Java. It's fully in Java. It has some ability to drop additional things onto the machine once you've got it running, which is what most people are doing. Is from what the early reports, this is kind of maybe a proof of concept, I'm going to say, that they're doing right now, is that it's kind of unstable in a auto startup kind of thing. So user goes, browses to the web page that's infected, the applet's running in their browser. It works pretty well from that point. So if somebody's waiting and is ready to start interacting with the machine, they can. But if you reboot your PC, once you've been infected, it might not automatically start up again. They'll probably work the kinks out of that. But what a lot of people apparently have been using this for is to drop additional payloads. Once you immediately get to it, they'll drop some additional things down on there that might be native for either Linux, Mac, or Windows, depending on what your platform is that you're browsing to it. So an interesting interesting trend that they're using Java as a mechanism here. We've talked about Java. A lot of exploits have been going on with it recently. I'm also a big advocate of Java as a good language, especially server-side. I love it. Developed in it for many years. But on the browser side, you're running untrusted code inside your machine that you're downloading off the internet. So I recommend you be careful about that. And if you can disable Java in your browser, I would recommend doing so. We've talked about that before as well, unless you have an absolute need to it. That's the basic story I have. I don't know if you guys had other insights or questions.
Well, I have a question about, you mentioned on the previous one that it's basically run as a hosted service, and that actually kind of, or at least enables that capability. I think that's kind of interesting. There are a lot of really legitimate ways to be hosting services, but this is a case where you have basically bad actors involved in this activity, and I wonder if that would be perhaps a motivation for part of the hosting. That is, if you're creating a facility to have other bad actors do your, bad activity, and then you can kind of pick and choose which ones you want to gather information about and perhaps use that as a targeting mechanism later on. So you could have, an organization that's really kind of behind the scenes, that somebody else be out in the front and as a scapegoat, so to speak. Perhaps they get caught in their activities, and then in the meantime, you're in the back end kind of gathering information and have the opportunity to use that if you want to, and just, not even pay attention to it if you don't.
Right. It's an interesting trend. It also enables, probably attackers who have a lower skill level to easily enter into the targeted advanced persistent threat type, arena. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought both of these are kind of interesting. You mentioned the, I think one of the important aspects here, you pointed it out, it's this cross-platform aspect. So it has potential to be able to target mobile devices as well as the traditional devices as well. And also one of the things they're going to want to be paying attention to going forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so thank you very much for that, John. And with that, obviously there's no piece of software that's a silver bullet, and neither are the tools for analyzing it. Is that right, Jim?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. This was primarily something that came to my attention from a regular viewer who pointed it out to us, but it got me thinking about some other stuff. There's a TechWorld blog post last week that quoted a professor from UC Santa Barbara saying, basically, when it comes to malware detection, a sandbox shouldn't be considered a silver bullet. And we have talked about sandboxing a lot in this program over the years. And it's still something that I at least highly recommend as an additional layer of defense. Mm-hmm. But the point of this article was that in trying to detect malware, analyze malware, a lot of the software out there uses various sandbox technologies, and the bad guys are aware of this, and so they have started, well, they have, it's not all that recent, but they add code to try to evade the sandbox or evade the analysis that's performed within the sandbox. The TechWorld article discussed some malware, puts some additional code in there that they called stalling code that kind of sits in the background, and rather than doing its malicious activity immediately, it kind of waits and hopes that the analysis times out before it does what it needs to do. But that got me thinking about, other techniques that the malware used to try to evade our analysis. That brought to mind another story that Symantec did also last week. about a variant of the ransom lock software that was using some other techniques to evade sandboxes, primarily used for automated analysis of the malware. And that one was actually kind of an interesting one in that it used a technique that I hadn't seen before. It essentially creates a shared memory segment and uses that to pass state, and it kills itself, restarts, to try to evade some of the automatic analysis. This diagram on the slide here that I pulled from their post basically shows what's going on here. They initialize, the malware runs the first time, and it creates the shared memory segment up here at number 2. And it has this value of 0 there when first creates the shared memory segment. That's the value that's encoded in the binary itself. But then as it runs, it changes the value in the shared memory segment, starts up a new copy of itself, and kills the old one. The new copy has 0 in the binary itself, but when it goes and reads the shared memory segment, it's got this new value in it. So it knows this isn't the first run of it. It does 2 iterations of this before it finally gets to the value where it starts doing its malicious activity. And what the guys at Symantec discovered is that some of the automated analysis environments out there will basically only watch until the initial process kills itself off. And so those automated toolboxes, didn't detect anything weird going on here. Some of them will just watch the entire system until some set time. That's the way that our the analysis system that I've set up works. Is it watches the entire system and care if one particular process dies. But this one was, I thought was kind of interesting. The malicious code in there is actually encrypted in the binary itself, and it doesn't decrypt it until it gets over here to this last version that's got the 32 in the shared memory segment, and that's when it finally decrypts the malicious stuff. So even if you're taking memory dumps of the initial process, you're not going to see the malicious code decrypted until it gets to this third stage. So I just thought it was kind of interesting. We know the bad guys are always changing their tactics to try to evade our analysis capabilities, and this was just a new and novel approach that I hadn't seen that I wanted to bring to everybody's attention.
Yeah, absolutely, Jim. I think this is a very good demonstration of the level of sophistication. Although, the technique here isn't really terribly sophisticated, but certainly this is one of the many things that are taking place, and pointing out that they're doing everything they can to sort of evade these things. I think you made a good point in that if you're doing a sort of a complete forensics analysis of a piece of malware, as you'd pointed out, it certainly is within the capability to, bypass these types of workarounds. But I think what these folks are probably trying to target is specifically, again, I think you pointed out, some of the automated and sort of quick checks that are being done in a sandbox to try to identify malware and the behavior of that malware. And certainly with, tens of thousands of variants of malware coming at organizations, they're looking for efficient ways to be able to test it, and this is a way that they could potentially bypass some of those tests.
Yep.
I was just going to mention that, a lot of these articles have been talking about evasion of analysis when in a sandbox, so that the malware is trying to skirt around any kind of automated analysis that realizes it's there. And that doesn't concern me as much, personally, as escape from the sandbox. So I still think there's a lot of room for running a sandbox kind of environment on your desktop in terms of, as long as, I don't care really if if a piece of malware is running inside my browser-based sandbox that I might have, as long as it doesn't actually escape and allow it to write to the actual hard drive itself, so that it persists beyond that session, so to speak. Anyway.
Exactly. That's that's what I was talking about at the very beginning there. That I still think that sandboxes as a layer of defense for the user are crucial here, and the bad guys are also trying to find ways of breaking out of those, but that's not what we're talking about with these two stories.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And, some of that sandboxing is getting much more capable, being able to do browser-specific sandboxes and protect against some of the really important things that we need to be concerned about or paying attention to. So I'm in agreement with both of you here as well that I think that's an encouraging technology and developing nicely. And with that, well, Jim, I guess obviously bind is very important to our DNS infrastructure, and we want to try to keep that patched. So what's happening here?
Yeah, ISC released an alert last week, and new versions of bind were released that patched a vulnerability. There are a couple of ways that the bad guys tend to use DNS servers for their malicious activities. One that we've talked about a lot of times is DNS amplification for DDoS. Another one is where they attempt to launch denial of service attacks against the DNS servers themselves, so that websites aren't available or users can't resolve. This particular vulnerability is one that unfortunately could be used for the latter type of attack. It's a memory exhaustion vulnerability in all of the current versions of bind up to 9.8.4 P2, 9.9.2 P2. Those are the two versions that have fixed this vulnerability. And from the looks of it, it's relatively simple attack. It is successful against recursive DNS servers or authoritative DNS servers. So if you're running bind, you really need to make sure that you get these patches applied in a timely fashion.
Yeah, obviously, as you said, this is one of these things where you obviously don't want your DNS servers being exhausted. What I find to be encouraging is that, generally speaking, when ISC identifies a vulnerability, they're pretty quick to get a patch out. Realizing that there's an awful lot of infrastructure and a lot of things that require it, to be a stable application. I think that the thing that really needs to be kind of paid attention to is the fact that it is something that's bundled in with a number of operating systems. It's part of Linux, part of actually most of the Unix-type operating systems, and a lot of users might not realize that they need to be active about patching applications like this. And so thank you for bringing that to the table here.
Yeah, fortunately, most of the popular Linux distributions are already pushing the patches for this out. So once it's available from your distribution, whatever your automated patching process is, you should apply it, and then you just need to restart it, and you're good to go.
All right, good. So let's take a little bit of a look at, and it's not a very extensive report here, let's take a look at the internet weather and some of the anomalies we've seen over the last week or so here. The first one is actually source activity. The source port 161 UDP, that's SNMP, and it seems to be a continuation of SNMP reflection attacks. And this is actually a particular case where it looks like there are some participants that we're going to need to, just give them a friendly call and let them know that there are probably some things they can do to to prevent being a participant in these attacks. This is a case where, servers, SNMP servers that are exposed to the internet are being used in a reflection type of attack, and it shows up as what we're showing here is actually byte volume increase. Now, clearly the more recent activity is not showing as a significant volume of activity in place, but it certainly does show that there are some anomalies here. This is actually a difference graph that is showing the difference in activity from what we typically expect to see. Nowhere near what we had seen back in the beginning of March timeframe, but still continuing denial of service attack activity there. Second item here is scanning activity on port 53 UDP. We've been reporting on this one as well. It's basically a continuation of what we had been seeing before. We have been reporting, in fact, the sort of the upward trend in activity. This is in terms of the number of sources that are scanning on port 53 UDP. It's showing an increase in terms of the number of peaks, that is the size of the peaks, as well as sort of the low-level activity as well in between these peaks. And it seems to have leveled off, but again, this is a case where we're seeing most of this activity coming from multiple addresses, quite a few addresses from a single provider in China. And, the probing volume itself is still relatively low, so they're staying under the radar, but we see certainly periodic and regular increases in the number of sources that are doing that scanning activity. Next one here is basically showing some of the denial of service attack activity that we've seen over the last 30 days or so here. And there are a number of different targets associated with this activity. In some cases, the volume of the attack activity has been reasonably large. I'm not showing specifically what the volume is. There's not really any point in doing that, but suffice to say, or take my word for it, the attacks in some cases are rather large. I think we reported a couple of weeks ago activity where this was actually a case where the botnet that was performing the attack didn't receive the stop command, and it continued to attack through the weekend, and there was a decay as bots were perhaps discovered as participating in the attack. Perhaps those servers were reset, and it basically took them out of the attack activity. That tapered off eventually and fizzled out when other attack activity was taking place. But needless to say, there is continuing denial of service attack activity. For the most part, this has not had a significant impact on the operation of these victims. That is, generally speaking, they've been doing a good job in terms of protecting themselves from those attacks. But as I said, that continues. The next item here, we've reported on this particular port a number of times in the past. It's port 5038 TCP that's associated with the asterisk voice over IP management interface. And we have, as I said, there have been a number of times in the past where we reported on this. It seemed that there was a lull period, perhaps about 60 days or so, where there wasn't really very much activity, a couple of spikes here, but we did see an increase in activity just in the last day or so. This is basically the majority of probes are coming from a single source in China, and we suspect that basically looking for vulnerable voice over IP systems that either can be used for capturing and perhaps used for fraudulent toll calling, or another option here might be to use it for some other type of service, perhaps to use as a gateway into an internal network. So you certainly want to be paying attention to any voice over IP interfaces that you have to the internet and how that might expose an internal enterprise network. Next year is our regular report. This is from April 1st. This is basically the top ports that have been probed. We see a couple that I guess aren't unusual, but certainly we aren't seeing typically regularly. One here is port 443 TCP. We don't usually see that as a probed port, so this is one interesting to observe. And we already reported on port 53 UDP activity. It's not only seen an increase in the number of sources that are probing it, but this also shows up as one of the top probe ports as well. Others that we typically expect to see here, port 23, port 3389, port 22 TCP, all remote access methods. And we also see our standard port 445 activity as well. And then, of course, the UDP ports associated with the peer-to-peer activity associated with that zero access botnet. And overlooked here, we also see this port 1433 TCP being probed as well. All of those being generally password guessing attacks. Next one here, looking at the most sources doing that probing. And again, no surprises. Really, the only one that looks like a significant remote access type attempt is this port 23 TCP, as we reported earlier. We also see some additional zero access probes and some of these others that are associated with ICMP. Perhaps what I should do in the future is look to filter some of those out. Some of those are caused by backscatter activity, either from probing activity on the network, or a denial of service attack can be backscatter associated with that as well. Then, of course, port 445 is the high runner on this one. Now, one other thing I thought would be useful to take a look at here, this is a graph of what we call the reconnaissance index. And in fact, it's basically a relative measurement of probing activity on the network. That is, how much we're seeing on the network. And it has two factors associated with it. It's in terms of the number of probes, as we look at in the pie chart, as well as the number of sources are a contributor to this index. So this is a relative index that is, it's basically scale adjusted so that it remains roughly stable. And a way to think about this is it's kind of like the inverse of a Dow Jones, for example, or a S&P 500. That is, generally speaking, and when you're looking at a stock index or a mutual fund or something, you want that to be going up. That's an opportunity for profits. For the reconnaissance index, if the reconnaissance index is going up, that's probably not a good thing from a network standpoint. It's basically perhaps an indication of worm infecting the network or some type of interest in exploiting ports. Now, one of the things that's interesting here, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the Karna botnet. That was the one where somebody had basically infected a number of devices, created a botnet, and used it to create basically to do a census of the internet. And what you can see here is a lot of the effects of that aggressive reconnaissance activity that was associated with that botnet. So right around the mid-June time frame here, perhaps late May, mid-June time frame, you can see that there was a significant increase in the reconnaissance index associated with not just the number of probes, but the number of sources that were doing that probing. That continued through the summer and then tapered off near the end of the summer, and there was some continuing activity, and then it finally dropped out in December, which is right around the time frame where that, after that botnet built up, it was able to do a lot of this, what was turned into that census report that we talked about in a previous episode a couple of weeks ago. So you can see clearly that the reconnaissance index captured that, and the good news here is that there is sort of a downward trend in terms of the reconnaissance activity, mostly in probes, but also in the number of sources that are doing that probing as well. Generally good news. So with that, I'd like to turn to John here. And John, do you have a concern for this week that has kind of been on your mind?
Yeah, actually I do, and it's not so much a security concern, but how people are reporting security events in the media. And, there was a lot of discussion around the Spam House attack. I don't know if we actually talked about it on the show, the DDoS attack against Spam House that occurred. And there was a lot of sensationalistic headlines created, like one was cyber bunker hosting site said to be dropping virtual nuclear bombs on the internet with massive global denial of service attacks, So it was really sensationalistic, and I don't think for the layperson, sometimes people don't really understand what that means, and I saw a lot of people reporting, oh, I couldn't get on the internet today. It must be related to that. And that's not the case. This type of attack was against, to Spam House, it was significant to them, but to the rest of the internet, it really shouldn't have had any impact whatsoever. Not to say that we aren't concerned about that kind of thing, but the way it's reported, I think, needs to be a little bit more responsibly done. and readers should be a little bit skeptical when they read headlines that have, comments like that in them. So, that's my concern. This is not a new thing. The media tends to, run with reports. They might read something on one blog site, and it gets reposted, and next thing you know, it's on some large, reputable media site, and the facts aren't all necessarily correct there, or at least they might be exaggerated somewhat. So that's kind of my concern for the week.
Yeah, John, I think you're right here. There are a couple of things. One is that as a reader, always be looking for the evidence, that is the tangible and substantial information that supports the claims that are being made here. And also consider who's writing the report or where it originated from. A lot of times there are things that are put out there basically to gain some market position, and in other cases basically what they're trying to do is generate clicks, and that's just part of the way the internet is. So it's important that readers be scrutinizing what they're reading and making sure that there are facts that are substantiating those claims. And in fact, there were actually some articles that were out there that were disputing some of those claims. That is, particularly in the U.S., that most of that attack was actually over in Europe. And in fact, I think I had read a place where they had said that most of that attack activity was originating from Eastern Europe, although I don't have any evidence to show for that. We certainly did not see much of that attack activity in the United States, and so a lot of the claims that it was slowing down the internet, well, there may have been some localized impact associated with that, but that localized impact would have been in Europe and not in the United States. So I think you bring some good points here, and it's important that readers be sort of scrutinizing what they take a look at. And certainly if you have questions about something like this, we'd be willing to try to address those here on ThreatTraq as well, so let us know.
Yeah, well, and some of the effect was, because it was an attack against Spamhaus, it did slow some email down in some places.
Oh, yeah.
Folks who use that for, blacklisting, but yeah, again, it was way overhyped.
Right. So thanks for bringing that, John. I guess I'll share one myself here, and I think this one is kind of, again, related to information about that Karna botnet. I continue to be concerned about systems that allow, and this is a case I'm inversing it here. I'm not putting the onus on the users in this case. I think the onus is on the systems themselves. Systems should not allow weak or no passwords. I think that that Karna botnet, the study that was associated with that, the Internet Census, points out very well that there are lots of systems out there with either weak or no passwords. They used only very, very rudimentary password guessing attacks to gain access to what they said were 400,000 systems on the Internet. And I don't think that was even a comprehensive list. There are lots of other things that are taking place. The botnets being built for denial of service attacks that are just using some basic password guessing activities to get into machines and use those for attacking purposes. So in my opinion here, no system should allow these, or software for that matter, should ship or install with a default password. I think that basically a basic startup criteria should require that not just a password be provided, but a decent password be provided. And, to have a hardware reset to reset that password if you really need to, so that it basically asks for a new password to be set. So this isn't complicated. It's, and I think it's a fundamental requirement that needs to be a part of every system that requires passwords. And so that's my concern for the week, and it'll probably extend well beyond a week as well.
Yeah, I would agree with you, of course. And case in point, if passwords were not weak on systems and everything required a strong password, the reconnaissance index we just talked about, where they scan for, Telnet, SSH, and these other types of things, would not be as successful, or maybe not even as be prolific as they are today. It's the fact that humans like to use simple passwords or default ones that allows or encourages attackers to scan for weak passwords on systems.
That's absolutely true.
I'm due for an update on the passwords that we've been seeing against our honeypots, so I'll try to do that in the next week or two.
Yeah, I think, thank you, Jim. I think that would be a good thing to look at. And, you know, one of the things I've been wondering about, I haven't seen recently, I've certainly seen the list of passwords. And I think maybe you've reported this in the past, but perhaps I wasn't paying close enough attention. But it'd be interesting to see which passwords are guessed first versus last, and to see if that actually the attackers are perhaps ranking those in terms of the ones that tend to be more successful. I would expect to be closer to the top of the list. So it'll be interesting to see how that comes out. I look forward to it. So that's our show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, as usual, you can email us at threattrack@list.att.com. You can find us on Twitter. Our handle is @ThreatTraq, and ThreatTraq video is available from the AT&T Tech channel. That's att.com/ThreatTraq. It's also available on YouTube. Just search for the name ThreatTraq. It's also available in our audio-only form on iTunes. And thanks again for joining us today. We'll be back with a new episode next week. And until then, keep your network safe.